The military brings together people from all walks of life, yet it's not surprising that many of the men who serve are those with a rugged, adventurous spirit. These are the kind of people who prefer spending their weekends trekking through dense forests or scaling rocky cliffs rather than engaging in more mundane activities. A major reason military personnel encounter strange and unexplainable events is their frequent deployment to isolated, untouched regions of the world. But such mysteries aren't confined to foreign soil. Even in the United States, there are plenty of remote areas where civilization feels like a distant concept. Take the Appalachian Mountains, for example. I once came across an intriguing map that plotted locations of missing persons across the U.S. Overlaid on top of it was another map, showing the country's extensive cave systems. The overlap was chilling. While some might suggest these disappearances are due to accidents or misfortune, others believe there's something more sinister lurking underground. Today, you'll hear two eerie accounts from veterans. The first comes from a Marine who served in Iraq, and the second from a man who served during the 1980s, although his specific branch of service remains unknown. Both men grew up exploring the wilderness, but after their unsettling experiences, their love for the woods turned into a deep-seated fear. These are their accounts of being hunted by something massive, intelligent, and capable of mimicking other animals. Brian's encounter, the stalker in the forest. The first story comes from a Marine who goes by the name Brian. He recounts a chilling experience that forever changed his perspective on the woods. After returning from his first tour in Iraq, Brian decided to revisit the forest of his hometown, a place he knew like the back of his hand. The region, where the desert transitioned into woodlands, had been his playground growing up. The forest was scattered with fascinating finds, like Native American artifacts and hidden caves, making it the perfect spot for exploration. During his leave, Brian teamed up with his best friend, another Marine nicknamed Boot due to his recent completion of boot camp. Their goal was simple: track and eliminate a pack of coyotes that had been terrorizing local ranchers. Coyotes, nocturnal by nature, are known for their eerie howls and cunning behavior, and the pair knew exactly how to track them. As they approached what they believed was a den, the howls shifted. At first, they chalked it up to the coyotes using new tactics, but soon they realized something wasn't right. The sounds were too deliberate, almost calculated, as if they were being lured in without a word. The two Marines fell into a silent tactical formation, retreating to a nearby grove to observe from a safer distance. Minutes turned into an hour, and the forest remained unervingly still. Then, something emerged from the shadows. It wasn't a coyote or anything they'd ever seen before. Standing at least 7 to 10 feet tall, the figure was humanoid but monstrous in size. Its movements were slow, deliberate, and unervingly calm. Overcome by fear, Brian fired his weapon, expecting the creature to collapse. Instead, it barely flinched. His friend fired too, but the results were the same. Realizing their weapons were ineffective, the two retreated quickly, abandoning the hunt altogether. Days later, they discovered the actual coyote den miles away, confirming their suspicions that the creature had deliberately misled them. To this day, Brian and his friend reflect on that night, knowing they were not the hunters but the hunted. Mark's tale, Whistling in the Dark. The second account takes us to Tennessee, along the Walden Ridge Trail. Mark, a veteran who grew up in a small mountain community, recalls a chilling encounter with a local legend known as Whistling Jack. The Ridge, a plateau bordered by dense forests and the Prentice Cooper Game Reserve, was a place Mark knew intimately. One summer evening, Mark and his cousin decided to explore a rarely traveled path. As the sun set, they heard a faint, melodic whistle echoing through the trees. At first, they dismissed it as the wind or a bird, but the sound grew closer and more deliberate. It mimicked the tune Mark's cousin had been whistling earlier, note for note. Curiosity turned to dread when they realized the sound was coming from a ridge above them, despite no visible path leading there. Shadows shifted among the trees, and the whistling continued, growing louder and more persistent. Mark's cousin, visibly shaken, suggested they head back. As they turned to leave, A branch snapped nearby, followed by a guttural growl that froze them in their tracks. They ran, ignoring the cuts and scrapes from low-hanging branches. When they finally reached home, their clothes were torn and their faces pale. Mark never returned to that trail, and he swears that whatever was out there that night wasn't human or animal. Both stories reveal the darker, more mysterious side of the wilderness. While the forests are beautiful and vast, they also harbor secrets that may never be fully understood. Whether these encounters were with cryptids, spirits, or something else entirely, one thing is certain. The unknown is closer than we think. When I was a kid, the mountain trails and old dirt roads were our playground. We'd spend hours riding bikes, hiking, hunting, or just wandering through the woods, uncovering their hidden wonders. Back in 1976, when I was 12, I had an old mini bike, a rusty, noisy thing that carried me deeper into the wilderness than ever before. That's where this story begins, with a forgotten dirt path we stumbled across. It wasn't just any trail. The grooves carved into the ground hinted at a history of wagon wheels, and maybe early automobiles, like the Model T, long before my time. One lazy afternoon, curiosity led me to ride down this trail alone. Emerging at the far end into a sparsely populated area, I heard a voice call out. An older woman stood on her front porch, waving me over. She was a familiar face, one of the few long-time residents in the area. I parked my bike and approached. "Did you come through that holler?" she asked, her tone half disbelief, half concern. Yes, ma'am," I replied, unsure what I'd done wrong. She shook her head firmly. "Boy, you should never go through there. There's a reason that road's blocked." Naturally, her warning only piqued my curiosity. Why not? What's wrong with it? The old woman motioned for me to sit down on the porch. Her grip on my arm was firm as she leaned closer. "I'll tell you a story. Believe it or don't, that's your business. But you ask anyone around here, and they'll tell you the same." This was the first time I heard about the legend of Whistling Jack. The name sounded almost comical to me at first, but she quickly explained that naming things after their sounds, like Bob Whites for their distinct calls, was common here. The story, however, was far from amusing. The Tale of the Hollow. Her account dated back to the early 1900s, long before modern conveniences reached the area. Two families, the Smiths and the Browns, lived on opposite sides of the hollow. Life was simple then, and the young men from both families often gathered on weekends to play cards, drink homemade spirits, and enjoy each other's company. One Saturday night, the gathering stretched past midnight, a rarity in those days when early mornings were a way of life. The Brown brothers saddled their horses and began the familiar journey home through the hollow. The trail dipped into a creek bed flanked by a large boulder. As they reached the crossing, a strange bird call echoed from the top of the rock. The sound startled their horses, causing all but one to bolt. The youngest brother, thrown from his horse, tumbled to the ground. His lantern miraculously survived the fall, lighting up the sandy creek bed. His older brothers, regaining control of their mounts farther up the trail, were suddenly met with the sharp crack of gunfire, 6 rapid shots from the youngest brother's revolver. They turned their horses around and raced back to the creek. What they found was horrifying. Their brother was on his knees by the lantern, shaking so badly he could barely reload his gun. Nearby lay his horse, its throat torn open. "I hit it," he stammered, his voice trembling. I never miss at this range. When he calmed down enough to explain, he described seeing 2 glowing red eyes atop the boulder just before the creature lunged at his horse. He had managed to fire several shots before it fled into the woods, leaving behind a putrid stench. It was large, covered in dark fur, and walked hunched over on 2 legs. Determined to recover the saddle and rifle pouch, the family returned to the scene at dawn, armed to the teeth. But when they arrived, the creek bed had been eerily cleaned. The horse's body, along with all its gear, was gone. Even the bloodstains were partially concealed beneath swept sand. No tracks, no trail. Just an ominous silence hanging over the hollow. My own encounter. The old woman's story unnerved me, but I swore to her I'd steer clear of that hollow from then on. For years, I kept my word, always taking the long way around. But my curiosity about the woods never left me. Fast forward to 13 years later. At 25, I returned to the mountain after a stint in the military and a brief, rocky marriage. The forest was my escape from the chaos in my mind. One spot in particular became my sanctuary, a grove of ancient pines atop sandstone cliffs on the mountain's western edge. These towering trees formed a serene cathedral, their fallen needles muffling every step. One evening, I wandered too far, losing track of time. By midnight, I found myself sitting near the cliffs, sipping bourbon and gazing at the distant valley lights. The peace was intoxicating, until it wasn't. A sound cut through the night air, a bobwhite call. It came from somewhere below me. At first, it seemed harmless, but then a second call answered from farther up the slope. Quail aren't nocturnal, I reminded myself, feeling a chill creep up my spine. When the first call repeated, this time closer, I knew something was wrong. Heart racing, I packed my gear hastily, slinging my shotgun over my shoulder. Moving carefully, I avoided using my flashlight, relying on the moonlight instead. I had no desire to reveal my position to whatever might be out there. As I climbed back toward the cliffs, the eerie calls continued, circling me like predators closing in. I paused, taping a flashlight to the barrel of my shotgun, preparing for whatever might come next. The forest, once my refuge, had transformed into something menacing. And deep down, I knew this encounter wasn't over. The calls of the strange bobwhites echoed intermittently, answering one another, always closing the distance no matter how cautiously or quickly I moved. By then, fear had begun to take root. I had spent my life navigating the woods, understanding their rhythms, the habits of their creatures, and the way nature worked. But this was something I had no experience with, something entirely foreign to me. And then it hit me. That story, the tale that old woman had told me over a decade ago, flashed through my mind with chilling clarity. I couldn't deny it any longer. I was being tracked, stalked. The weight of that realization sent adrenaline surging through my body, sharpening my senses and quickening my steps. But with fear came determination. If I was being hunted, I wouldn't go down without a fight. My mind raced, piecing together a plan. The sounds of movement were closer now, deliberate and heavy, too substantial for anything ordinary. I would stop occasionally, only to hear a faint shuffle behind me, as if they were mimicking my movements, mirroring every step. I knew the forest well and had one advantage, a path they likely didn't anticipate. Ahead of me was a cliff, its sandstone face riddled with cracks and crevices shaped by centuries of weathering. One particular split formed a deep V, tapering at the bottom to a narrow gap just wide enough to crawl through. Inside was a ledge that climbed steeply upwards, leading to an overhang that opened onto a rock slide. If I could make it to the top, I'd have the high ground, but I needed to move fast. The escape. Reaching the crevice, I squeezed inside, shoving my pack and shotgun ahead of me. There was no time for stealth. I scrambled and dragged myself through, the narrow space closing around me. The rough stone scraped my arms, but I didn't stop. Every second felt like an eternity. As I emerged onto the ledge, I slung my pack over my shoulder and gripped the rock slide, climbing on all fours. Below, I could hear them, shuffling at the base of the cliff. Why weren't they following me into the crevice? The thought sent shivers down my spine, but I didn't linger. I climbed higher. Finally, I reached the top and ran, sprinting into the old-growth pine grove. In the grove's center, surrounded by towering pines, I leaned against a tree, my chest heaving. I dropped my pack, set down my shotgun, and fumbled for the bourbon tucked inside. My hands were trembling so badly that half the drink spilled before it even touched my lips. Then I heard it again, a whistle, followed by deliberate, heavy footsteps. They had made it to the top. Somehow, impossibly, they had bypassed the cliff's sheer face. The grove was the only place they could have emerged from, and yet they were here. My heart pounded as I realized their steps were unnervingly long, longer than any man's stride. They moved steadily, deliberately, toward the edge of the grove. I grabbed my shotgun, turned on the flashlight I had taped to the barrel, and pumped around into the chamber. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning for movement. The footsteps stopped, just outside the grove, hidden in the dense brush. Why weren't they advancing? The air grew thick with tension as I kept the light fixed on the spot where the sound had last come from. Suddenly, the steps began again, but this time they split. One moved left, the other right, circling me. I swung the light back and forth, trying to track them, but I couldn't see a thing. My breath quickened. Panic was setting in. I squeezed the trigger, firing blindly into the dark. The blast echoed through the woods, followed by another shot. And then I heard it, a scream, a guttural, rage-filled howl that reverberated through the grove. It wasn't human, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The sound was primal, filled with fury and something that felt disturbingly intelligent. My blood turned to ice. I could hear them crashing through the brush, retreating deeper into the forest. For reasons I didn't understand, they left. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, my flashlight still scanning the grove. The silence stretched on, broken only by the distant rustle of leaves. When I finally dared to look at my watch, it was 3:18 a.m. Dawn was still hours away. I stayed rooted in that grove until the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the trees. Only then did I gather my things and make my way home, moving as fast as I could. A lifetime of avoidance. In the 28 years since that night, I've never set foot in those woods again. I still hike, camp, and fish, but I've given up hunting entirely. A few months after that encounter, I moved away, settling in Alabama for over 2 decades. But fate has a way of circling back. In 2014, I inherited a property near the Sequatchie Valley, just a few miles from the mountain I had once called home. From my porch, I can see the cliffs that haunt my memories. And though I've never gone back, I can't help but feel that the forest hasn't forgotten me. Strange things began happening soon after I moved in. My daughter's dog, Buddy, a large, fearless mutt, started acting strangely at night. He would bark and growl at the woods, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. On a few occasions, his behavior was so alarming that I grabbed my rifle and went outside to investigate. But there was never anything there, just the rustle of leaves and the uneasy feeling that something was watching. Then one night I heard it, heavy, deliberate steps in the brush. My flashlight couldn't penetrate the dense undergrowth, but the sound was unmistakable. It wasn't an animal, not any animal I knew. Buddy barked furiously, glancing back at me as if urging me to do something. I stood frozen, rifle in hand, until the steps faded into the distance. That was the last time I heard them. Buddy would still bark at the woods on occasion, but the footsteps never returned. Even so, the memory lingers, a reminder that some things are better left undisturbed.